History books often paint the pre-contact Americas as a pristine paradise where humans lived in effortless harmony with nature. This is a lie. Nature is not a mother, she is a predator. To live in the Great Plains, the dense Amazon, or the frozen Arctic was to be in a state of permanent mobilization. Before the first European sail broke the horizon, survival was a brutal, calculated game of calories and endurance. Every breath was earned. Every meal was a victory.
In the high winter of the North, the human body is a furnace that demands constant fuel. But when the snow buried the tracks of the elk, the calorie debt began. Indigenous survival relied on advanced bioengineering. Take pemmican, a mixture of lean, dried meat, rendered fat, and acid-rich berries. It was the original superfood, a high-density fuel that could last for years. But when the pemmican ran out, the reality was grim. Tribes survived on famine foods, boiled leather, pine bark, and the marrow of frozen bones. They didn't just eat to live, they ate to stay one step ahead of the biological collapse that cold weather triggers in the human frame. Without pharmacies, an infection was a death sentence. Yet indigenous medicine was far from primitive. It was a rigorous trial-and-error science of the soil. They used willow bark containing salicin, the natural precursor to aspirin, to dull the throbbing pain of bone fractures. For open wounds, they used the living bandages of sphagnum moss, which is naturally antiseptic and incredibly absorbent. In some regions, they practiced maggot therapy, placing specific larvae into gangrenous wounds to eat away dead tissue while leaving the healthy flesh intact. It was grisly, it was painful, but it worked. The peril of birth. The most dangerous journey was not across a frozen tundra, but through the birth canal. In a world without sterile surgery, childbirth was the ultimate test of female resilience. There were no painkillers. Women often gave birth in a squatting position to use gravity, supported by midwives who used herbal uterine stimulants like blue cohosh. If the baby was breech or the mother hemorrhaged, there were no emergency rooms. The silence of the birthing lodge was often broken by the harsh reality of natural selection. Only the strongest survived the first night. To be an indigenous person in this era was to possess a body optimized for the wild. Their senses were tuned to frequencies we have long forgotten. They could smell rain hours before it arrived and track animals by the slight displacement of a single blade of grass. This wasn't magic. It was the result of a life where a single lapse in observation meant death. This was the world of the iron body, a world of extreme hardship, but also of a profound visceral strength that the modern world can barely comprehend.
War was not an anomaly. It was an integral part of the social and spiritual fabric. But indigenous warfare was not about the mass slaughter of European total war. It was about prestige, revenge, and the demonstration of supreme psychological control. Whether it was the Mohawk in the east or the Comanche in the west, the warrior was defined by his relationship with pain. To show fear was to lose your soul. In many eastern woodland tribes, the fate of a captured enemy was a ritualized nightmare. This wasn't senseless cruelty, it was a spiritual test. The captive was often subjected to the gauntlet or prolonged torture by fire. The goal of the captor was to break the victim's spirit. The goal of the victim was to die with a song of defiance on his lips. This psychological stoicism was a survival mechanism. If you could endure the ultimate pain without screaming, you robbed your enemy of their victory. You died untouched. Battlefield injuries were devastating. Stone-tipped arrows didn't just pierce, they shattered upon impact, leaving shards of flint or obsidian deep in the muscle. Indigenous surgeons developed specialized bone tools to probe and extract these fragments. They used cauterization, searing wounds with red-hot stones to stop arterial bleeding. The pain was blinding, yet warriors were expected to remain silent. This cultivated a level of pain tolerance that shocked early European observers, who described indigenous men undergoing agonizing procedures without moving a muscle. Survival wasn't just physical, it was a war of the mind. To become a man, one had to face the great silence. The vision quest involved 4 days and nights alone in the wilderness without food or water. This induced a state of physiological ketosis and hallucination. In this weakened state, the youth had to survive the elements and his own internal demons. If he panicked, he died or returned in shame. If he endured, he found his spirit guide. This ritual was a simulation of the ultimate survival scenario. It taught the mind to function when the body had nothing left to give. Imagine standing on a beach where for 10,000 years the horizon held nothing but the sun and the sea. Suddenly, mountains of wood and white cloth rise from the waves. For the indigenous people, the arrival of the Europeans wasn't just a meeting of different cultures, it was an encounter with the extraterrestrial. These newcomers arrived in floating islands covered in shining skins of steel, carrying sticks that spat thunder. The shock was total. The conceptual gap between a Stone Age survivalist and a Renaissance explorer was a chasm that could not be bridged by words. The initial contact was a dance of profound confusion. To the indigenous mind, land was a living entity, like the air or the ocean. It could not be owned, only used. To the Europeans, land was a commodity to be gridded, fenced, and deeded. This was the first silent death of their world. Early exchanges of beaver pelts for glass beads and iron kettles seemed like a fair trade to the tribes. Iron stayed sharp longer than stone, and wool stayed warm even when wet. But these miracle goods were a Trojan horse. They created a dependency that slowly eroded ancient survival skills. Once a tribe stopped knapping flint because they had iron knives, they were no longer truly independent. The deepest misunderstanding was invisible. To indigenous peoples, land was not property. It was a living system, like air or water. You didn't own it, you belonged to it. To Europeans, land was a resource to be measured, fenced, sold, and inherited. When treaties were signed, the two sides believed they were agreeing to completely different things. One side believed they were sharing access, the other believed they were purchasing reality itself. This wasn't miscommunication, it was the first silent death of an entire worldview. Indigenous people did what they had always done. They prayed. They used medicine. They isolated the sick. Nothing worked. Entire families vanished in days. Elders, the carriers of knowledge, memory, survival techniques, died first. It was not just death, it was cultural amputation. Imagine losing every book, every teacher, every memory, all at once. That was the scale of the loss. By the time smoke cleared from the first conflicts, the truth became unavoidable. These strangers were not visitors. They were an invasive force. They brought animals that destroyed crops, ideas that erased identity, and diseases that killed without mercy. The world of the iron body, honed by pain, endurance, and balance, was under siege, and worse was coming.